Hello, everyone. This is Gene Geog History. It's been a while, but obviously, there's just been a lot going on, not only just in my real life, but with Hurricane Melissa just going through, of course, Jamaica and to a lesser extent, Cuba, Haiti, and I think the Bahamas as well. That really kind of just drained me, and it's really just unfortunate what's happening over there. And I'm hoping that everyone who is in that area is remaining safe and they can recover as best as they could under the circumstance. Anyways, today's video is going to be about the Spanish Caribbean, and what I'm going to focus on are the racial demographics in the Spanish Caribbean. But before we get there, obviously I have to explain what the Spanish Caribbean is. So, the Spanish Caribbean are places in the Caribbean that were predominantly ruled by Spain, i.e., the Spanish and the imprints are left there today, despite us being in a post colonial time frame. These areas have Spanish as their main language, and there's still a lot of element of Spanish culture that's still on the land. So the three main territories historically under Spanish rule that retained Spanish as their dominant language today are Cuba, the Dominican Republic, and Puerto Rico. So we're going to be focusing on these three territories, and they all share Spanish colonization, African slavery, and indigenous decimation, in addition to later European and Asian immigration in common. But are the demographics equal in each of these three areas? That's something that we're going to get into now, essentially. I've looked throughout many sources regarding the three Spanish Caribbean countries or territories to see their main ethnic and racial compositions and demographics. And in general, there's really only three major ones. So the first one is the white population. These are people of essentially overwhelming European descent, or they're just white people. Most of these people are Spaniards, or they have overwhelming Spaniard descent, though there are other white populations that migrated to these three areas, though definitely much less than the obvious Spanish descended. The second is the black, i.e., the African descended people in these three territories. And obviously, most of these people came from West Africa through the slave trade, and they pretty much were slaves. They came from many different areas within West or Central Africa, so you can't pinpoint them to one country. And doesn't help that a lot of the countries that are now known in Africa weren't created when a lot of these people who would become slaves in these areas were taken from Africa. Obviously, there has been some other black migration from mainly other areas in the Caribbean, so that kind of explains it. And the third demographic in these three regions are the mixed race group. And this is interesting because a lot of them are mulatto, though a lot of them have other terms like Indio and some others that we're definitely going to get into. But these three regions heavily embrace being mixed race. There is no one drop rule, so if you're mixed, you are acknowledged as that. Though some people see that as a whitening tool, though that's a whole another topic that we may or may not get into. I couldn't really find any large groups of people from the other populations, as these are just the three main ones. And you'll see that there aren't any indigenous people in any of these three regions when it comes to the racial demographics, because most of them were wiped out and decimated once they were in contact with the Europeans who brought over a lot of diseases, and then there's of course a lot of wars and abuse and all that jazz. So I want to go over the white populations in these three countries or territories, and I'm going to start with the Dominican Republic. So they have a population of roughly around 11 million people, and their white population is only 15% of that. So there aren't many white Dominicans, and that kind of makes sense based on the demographics. And by white, I'm referring to people who are predominantly Spanish and or Canary Islanders descent, because that's usually where the white admixture comes in, and the white people who are in the Dominican Republic, they have overwhelming amounts of Spaniard and Canary Islander descent. There might be some that have French descent, especially with the borderline of Haiti, and a lot of Lebanese people did come over to move into the Caribbean, so that might be it as well. But yeah, overall, there's not many people in the Dominican Republic that are white. Now, regarding Cuba, they also have a population of around 11 million people. But unlike the Dominican Republic, their white population is estimated to be around 60 to 65% of the population, where yet again, most of the white population would descend from Spain in places like Andalusia, Galicia, so those are in southern Spain, and the Canary Islands, with smaller later waves from Catalonia, Italy, and Eastern Europe. This was around the time where I believe both the Dominican Republic and Cuba opened up their immigration through the 19th and 20th century so they could whiten their population. So I think this is one of the reasons why Cuba has a huge population that consists of white people. And the diaspora of Cuba, especially in Miami and United States, is overwhelmingly white. No, that kind of leads into the talks of the embargo and what happened in the 50s, where a lot of the white Cubans moved to the States and out of Cuba, where the ones that remained on the island were more mixed. And this might be an element of a lot of mixed people identifying as white, which we're going to get into Puerto Rico, which has a population of roughly around 3.2 million people on the island. Apparently, there's more Puerto Ricans in the mainland USA than the island, which is very interesting, almost twice the amount. I have to delve more into that. For the longest time, their data was very similar to Cuba's when it comes to the amounts that identified as white. I always saw like 60 to 70% identified as white. Up until the recent US Census changes, where now only 15 to 25% of Puerto Ricans identify as white, and it comes from the same sources as they do from the Dominican Republic and Cuba, where they're mostly Spanish, so from Spain through southern Spain, and some Canary Islanders and smaller Christian and Irish influences. Okay, so when it comes to the census, many Puerto Ricans identify as white on paper but embrace a mixed Caribbean identity culturally. There's really a lot I can get into with that, but all three regions essentially had a blanqueamiento, mezcla la raza, and a whitening process where they went and some still do go out of their way to whiten their population. And with the recent census change that took place, I believe, in 2020, a lot of them now identify as mixed. So that's kind of nuance with the white label, especially in Puerto Rico. But that's a U.S. territory. If there are recent changes in the Cuban and the Dominican Republic census, no, the Cuban census especially, things might be different. Now I'm going to talk about the black populations within these three regions. And of course, the first region I'm talking about is the Dominican Republic, which is often seen as the quote unquote blackest part of the not only just the Spanish Caribbean but Latin America as well. But when you really look into the ancestry results and do further research, most of these people are not black, but we're going to get to that a bit later. When it comes to the actual black demographic in the Dominican Republic, it's only 15% of the population. So 15% of roughly 11 million people in the Dominican Republic. So give or take a million or so. So these are people who are mostly descendants of enslaved Africans who were brought over to produce sugar plantation. And you can definitely tell that these people are unambiguously black and they stand out a lot compared to most Dominicans who aren't black. So the second region that I'm talking about is Cuba, and they have similar demographics to the Dominican Republic when it comes to their black population, where it's 10 to 15% of the 11 million people approximately in Cuba, so roughly a million too. But what's interesting about Cuba is that it's mainly concentrated historically in Havana, Matanzas, and the Orient provinces. So I believe that is eastern Cuba. I'm not too sure about that, but I think that's where most of the Black Cubans are. And it makes sense because that's closest to Jamaica and whatnot. So, interestingly enough, Cuba did have one of the largest African slave populations in the Caribbean by the 19th century, but I'm sure some of the demographics changed. And yeah, so the third and final region I'm discussing when it comes to the black population is Puerto Rico, where about 5 to 10% of the Puerto Ricans are black. And they're also concentrated heavily in coastal areas like Louisa and Ponce. And I believe that is Western Puerto Rico. I'd have to double check. Sorry, my bad. No, they're all relatively scattered, but they're more heavily in certain areas within Puerto Rico. So 10%, 5 to 10% out of 3 million. So that's giving like 200 to 300,000 people. And yeah, and the final group in these three regions, and it's for most of them, the main racial group is the mixed race group. These are either mulattoes or mestizos, or they use those two terms interchangeably. But later on, we'll dive into whether the mixed race people in these three regions are mulatto or mestizo, since they do have different meanings. As mulatto are people who are mixed with European white and African black, mainly, and mestizo are people who are mixed with European white and Native Amerindian indigenous. So, with the Dominican Republic, 70% of their population identifies as mixed race, and unlike some of the others, they've always identified this way, or they use the term Indio, which is a local category often used for mixed race people with brown skin, emphasizing distance from the black identity due to historical anti Haitianism and whitening ideas. So that's why they use that term Indio, though when you look at it, they have minimal to no Indio admixture in them, as most Dominicans have both European, either Spanish or Canarian, and African, either Central or West African ancestry, with varying indigenous Taino remnants. And by remnants, they mean very, very little. So, with Cuba, about 25 to 30% of the Cuban population identify as mixed race, brackets in mulatto and mestizo, but we'll later get into which one they fit closer to. But the main mixed race people in Cuba are mixtures of Spanish and African ancestry, with the indigenous components being minimal to none as well, just like the Dominican Republic. And what's interesting is that due to many of the whitest Cubans leaving to go to the United States, the actual island might be more mixed race than they identify on the census. So that's kind of an interesting dichotomy there. So with Puerto Rico, we do have a recent change where now 70 to 80% of the population identify as mixed race, though that wasn't even the case a decade ago and most of the years prior, where they mainly identified as white, despite having the same admixture. So the mixed race category in Puerto Rico includes white plus African plus Taino, as many Puerto Ricans are tri-hybrid and triracial with indigenous Taino ancestry, persisting culturally and genetically a lot more than Cuba and the Dominican Republic in comparison. So Puerto Ricans identify with their national ties rather than racial, emphasizing Boricua or Taino roots as unifying myths. And yeah, so we're going to get into the genetic ancestry breakdowns and admixtures to see what the mixed race group are closer to. So now that we broke down the major racial groups in the Spanish Caribbean, I want to get into the broad average genetic admixture averages for each of the regions. And notice how I said the average and not the standard for each and every single person, since obviously some people will be either more European than the average, less European than the average, more African than the average, less African than the average, more indigenous than the average, and less indigenous than the average. So with Cuba, the average admixture is 70 to 75% European, 20 to 25% African, and 5 to 10% indigenous. So this is what the average person in Cuba's admixture would look like based on the amount that exists in the majority of Cuba. For the Dominican Republic, the average Dominican admixture for European is 55 to 60%, the average for African is 35 to 40%, and the average for indigenous in the Dominican Republic is 5 to 10%. So you clearly see it's less European and more African compared to Cuba, but they have the same minimal amount of indigenous DNA. With Puerto Rico, the average European admixture amount is 65 to 70%, the average African admixture amount is 20 to 25%, and the average indigenous amount is 10 to 15%. So it's a bit less than Cuba regarding the European mixture, but it's roughly around the same. There's not much difference. The African admixture in Puerto Rico is the same as Cuba and much less than Dominican. Puerto Rico also has more European admixture than the Dominican Republic, but the main difference here is the indigenous amount in Puerto Rico. It's still more, a lot more, yeah, a bit more than Cuba and the Dominican Republic by almost twice the amount, but it's still not as much compared to the African and the European components in Puerto Rico. So in that element, it's mainly the European and African that are the two main ones through all three regions. So that's the consistency there, which isn't the case with Central America and South America. So I mentioned earlier how they put mestizo slash mulatto in the same bracket, though those two words mean different things. When it came to the mixed populations of these three areas, I wanted to figure out what mixed groups specifically do these countries fall under. So, as you see in the bottom chart, we have a different set of averages per country. So, with the Dominican Republic, it's 60% European, 35% African, 5% indigenous. With Cuba, it's 70% European, 25% African, and 5% indigenous. Where Puerto Rico, it's 67% European, 21% African, and 12% indigenous. With the Dominican Republic, they are mostly mulatto, not mestizo, as the bulk admixture in the country is African and European. Indigenous Taino ancestry survived minimally in the genome, often 5 to 10% at most, and it's mostly in the maternal lines, mtDNA. So while people may refer to quote unquote Taino roots culturally, the genetic mix is predominantly mulatto, not mestizo. And Dominican elites promoted the Indio label, i.e., Indian, as a local racial label for people of mixed African and European descent, though it makes sense because the Indio's not a part of that equation, really. And they essentially used it as a euphemism for mulatto, and they use that term to distance themselves from black, as it's better to be Indio even though you barely have that ancestry anywhere, and it's not on your phenotype, than black. With Cuba, the mixed population there is also overwhelmingly mulatto, as Cuba imported one of the largest African slave populations in the hemisphere during the 18th to 19th century, so this is during the 1700s to the 1800s. The Tainos were nearly wiped out by the mid 1500s, just like the Dominican Republic, with very limited genetic survival. So, modern Cubans, so overall, they are either mainly white or mulatto, with very little indigenous component existing there, except for very, very isolated eastern communities. Though you will notice that in the eastern provinces like Oriente, especially Santo de Cuba, they have higher African ancestry, while western Cuba, i.e., Havana, Pena de Rio, leans more European. And Puerto Rico, they are definitely more interesting in this regard, as they are also mixed overall, but in the tri-hybrid sense, so European plus African plus Taino. But they're definitely more mulatto leaning by proportion compared to mestizo. So Puerto Rico retained the highest indigenous genetic input in the Spanish Caribbean due to endogamy and isolation of the surviving Taino woman in the 1500s to 1600s. However, most people's phenotypes and genealogies are still closer to mulatto or European mixed, with indigenous ancestry showing mainly at the mitochondrial level. So culturally, people may say that we're a mix of Spanish, African, and Taino, but in biological terms, mulatto admixture dominates with a notable indigenous remnant. Alrighty, so that concludes my video regarding the racial demographics of the Spanish Caribbean and just talking briefly about the Spanish Caribbean in general, because obviously they stand out from the rest of the Caribbean, whether they're Francophone or Anglophone, regarding their racial dynamics, because the Spanish handled slavery and colonization differently, but they obviously stood out from the non Spanish Caribbean Latin America, so Central America and South America, because they were islands, so they're definitely more isolated in that regard, and two, the admixtures that happened in the Spanish Caribbean leaned more mulatto than more mestizo leaning, where it was everywhere else in Latin America. I definitely felt like that should have been brought to the forefront, or that should be discussed more. And also just comparing and contrasting the dynamics between the two countries regarding their demographics as well. That was also very interesting to look at. Anyways, thank you all for watching, and I'll be back with something soon, hopefully.